The fire is almost out. Not the warm, domestic kind that sits behind glass in a living room. The real thing. Unpredictable. Alive. The kind that took 2 hours of deliberate effort to coax from friction and dry grass. The kind that separated your family from the cold mathematics of a night that genuinely wanted to kill you. Around 10,000 BCE, across the African savanna, the Fertile Crescent, the river valleys of what would eventually become China, human beings did something in those last dying minutes of firelight that no anthropologist initially thought to study, because it looked too ordinary, too mundane. They counted what they had. Not philosophically, physically. Fingers touching the edge of dried meat portions. Eyes moving across sleeping children to confirm the number. Hands running along the shaft of a spear to feel for damage. The mental map of water sources committed to memory one more time, updated with the day's new information. This was not anxiety. This was not insomnia. This was the cognitive ritual that determined whether the organism survived to see dawn. The people who did it with precision and consistency, who accounted for every resource, identified every gap, calibrated their morning plan against the reality of what they actually possessed. Those people left descendants. The ones who didn't, who fell into sleep with optimistic assumptions about tomorrow's provisions, largely didn't. You are, in the most clinical possible sense, the biological product of accountants. And then civilization came along and convinced you that keeping track of money was somehow beneath you. The relationship between human beings and resource accounting is not a modern invention. It is not a bourgeois habit. It is not a personality trait that some people have and others don't. It is a 300,000-year-old survival mechanism that got buried under a remarkably sophisticated cultural apparatus specifically designed to make the people who benefit from your financial ignorance feel comfortable while doing so. The mechanism is old. The burial is recent. And understanding exactly how the burial was engineered is the beginning of something that polite financial conversation almost never reaches. Behavioral economists at the University of Nottingham published findings in 2018 confirming what should have been obvious: that the frequency with which individuals review their financial position correlates directly with their long-term wealth accumulation, independent of income level. Not investment sophistication, not access to capital markets, not education. The simple act of regularly and precisely knowing where one stands financially proved to be among the most reliable predictors of financial resilience across income brackets. The researchers called it financial engagement. Our ancestors, crouching near dying fires on the African plains, had no name for it. They simply understood, in whatever prelinguistic way understanding worked before language, that not knowing was the same as dying. The architecture of modern financial culture was not constructed to help people engage. It was constructed to help institutions profit from disengagement. That distinction seems simple until you trace the engineering. Until you look at how deliberately the scaffolding was built, beam by beam, across centuries of institutional design. The complexity of financial products, the impenetrability of credit agreements, the psychological framing of spending as identity. None of this emerged accidentally. It emerged from a very clear incentive structure. Institutions that profit from debt require borrowers, and borrowers are far easier to create from people who have lost the habit of counting what they have before they fall asleep. The Roman Empire understood this in its own way. The Roman banking system, the Argentarii, who operated from the Forum, kept meticulous daily ledgers called rations. What made Rome's financial infrastructure remarkable was not its sophistication but its obsessiveness. Roman merchants recorded not just transactions but the time of day, the names of witnesses, the condition of goods. This was not bureaucratic excess. This was a civilization that had built its expansion on the knowledge that precise accounting was power, that the man who knew his position with exactitude could make decisions that the man operating on approximation could not. When Roman banking eventually collapsed in the 3rd century, and it did collapse catastrophically, one of the documented contributing factors was the debasement of ledger-keeping itself. The Argentarii began manipulating rations. The trusted mechanism of precision became a mechanism of fraud. The empire's financial infrastructure corroded from the inside, and the debasement of honest accounting preceded the military and political collapse by decades. The lesson Rome offers is not that accounting is virtuous. It's that accounting is structural. The civilization that stopped counting accurately stopped functioning accurately. The collapse was not moral. It was mechanical. Medieval European merchant culture rediscovered this with almost violent clarity. The Medici banking system, which financed popes, funded wars, and effectively ran Florence for most of the 15th century, was built not on brilliant investment strategy but on something far more mundane: the double-entry bookkeeping system that Luca Pacioli codified in 1494. Pacioli didn't invent double-entry bookkeeping. He systematized what Venetian and Florentine merchants had been doing for a century. And what they had been doing was revolutionary in its simplicity. Every transaction entered twice. Every asset matched against a liability. Every night, the books balanced or they didn't, and if they didn't, work stopped until the discrepancy was found. The Medici didn't become the most powerful banking family in Europe because Cosimo de' Medici was a visionary. He was, to a significant degree, a man who refused to go to sleep until he knew exactly what he had. The psychological mechanism behind this is now documented in behavioral science. Roy Baumeister's research on what he termed ego depletion, the idea that cognitive resources diminish across a day as decisions accumulate, has implications for financial behavior that most financial advisors never discuss. By the time the average modern person reaches the end of their day, their capacity for precise cognitive work has been ground down by hours of micro-decisions. This is precisely the moment when financial institutions design their most emotionally resonant advertising. The late-night shopping impulse is not an accident. It is not a weakness of character. It is the exploitation of a biological resource management problem that evolution never anticipated in a world of artificial light, unlimited purchasing access, and trillion-dollar marketing budgets. Your ancestors counted by firelight because it was quiet, because the day's cognitive demands had settled, because the primitive brain understood that before unconsciousness came, inventory should be confirmed. Modern commercial culture has invaded that window and filled it with stimulation specifically calibrated to prevent the counting. The numbers are not abstract. Americans carry an average of $6,194 in credit card debt. Not because they earned less than they spent in some catastrophic single event, but because the gap between what they believe they spend and what they actually spend widens slowly, silently, across hundreds of small transactions that never get reviewed. A 2021 study by the Sloan MIT Center for Finance found that consumers systematically underestimate their monthly discretionary spending by an average of 40%. 40%. The average person walking through their day believes they are spending significantly less than they are, and they believe this not because they are unintelligent, but because the act of precise daily accounting, the firelight ritual, has been socially coded as either obsessive or unnecessary. Here is where the mechanism gets genuinely interesting, because the social coding did not happen by accident. Thorstein Veblen, writing in 1899 in The Theory of the Leisure Class, identified something that financial culture still refuses to fully absorb, that the conspicuous avoidance of precise money tracking became, at a certain point in Western history, a status signal. The wealthy merchant class of the 17th and 18th centuries began to distinguish themselves from tradespeople not just by what they owned but by their performed indifference to the counting of it. To be seen as someone who checked prices was to be seen as someone for whom prices mattered. The aristocratic posture was ignorance as elegance. This posture filtered down through the centuries and mutated into something more broadly cultural: the vague social embarrassment around budgeting, the coded message that people who track their spending carefully are somehow anxious, small-minded, or not yet arrived. Pause. The upper class learned to delegate their counting rather than abandon it. That is the distinction almost nobody discusses. The Vanderbilts had accountants. The Rockefellers had financial offices. The counted remained counted. It was simply counted by professionals on retainer, insulated from view. What got exported to the middle and working class was the aesthetic of not counting, stripped of the infrastructure that made that aesthetic survivable for those at the top. The working and middle classes absorbed the posture of the aristocracy without inheriting the apparatus that made the aristocracy's posture functional. This is one of the cleanest examples of cultural technology transfer that has ever been pulled off in the history of consumer capitalism. The behavioral science literature on this is unambiguous. Researchers at Harvard Business School, in studies on what they called prospective accounting, found that individuals who engaged in nightly financial review, even informally, even for just 10 to 15 minutes, showed measurably different financial outcomes within 18 months compared to control groups. Not because they suddenly earned more. Not because their investment strategies changed. Because the act of daily honest accounting forced a confrontation with reality that optimistic avoidance cannot. The gap between what people intend and what they actually do with money closes fastest under the light of regular examination. This is not a metaphor. This is a cognitive architecture fact. The brain cannot course-correct what it has not observed. Benjamin Franklin understood this with a clarity that his famous aphorisms obscure. The Poor Richard's Almanac framing makes Franklin easy to dismiss as a moralizer, a founding father dispensing Protestant virtue about thrift. But Franklin's actual practice was something harder and less comfortable than that. He kept a personal account book that tracked, in meticulous detail, every expenditure of his adult life. He reviewed it nightly. He made it a condition of his professional identity to know, at the end of every day, exactly where he stood. Franklin was not virtuous about money. He was strategic about it. He understood that imprecision in financial self-knowledge was the precondition for exploitation by others, and that the people who most benefited from imprecision in others would always have a cultural argument ready for why precise self-accounting was somehow beneath the finer sort of person. The turn arrives here, and it requires sitting with a discomfort that most financial content simply skips past. The financial ritual that ancient humans performed before sleep was not about discipline. It was not about virtue. It was not about being responsible or being good. It was about power, specifically about the power differential between the person who knows their position precisely and the person who operates on comfortable approximation. The firelight accounting was not a moral act. It was a strategic one. And the reason it has been systematically discouraged in modern consumer culture is not because it makes people anxious, or because it promotes unhealthy relationships with money, or any of the therapeutic framing that gets applied to the subject. It has been systematically discouraged because a population that knows exactly what it has, exactly what it owes, and exactly where the gap lies is a population that is substantially harder to sell to, harder to lend to on extractive terms, and harder to keep in the low-awareness financial states that generate the most reliable consumer spending. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require boardrooms and secret agreements. It only requires that the incentive structure of a consumer economy rewards the institutions that most effectively prevent precise financial self-awareness, and punishes nothing when those institutions succeed. The system is not malevolent. It is optimized. And it is optimized against the kind of person who sits quietly at the end of the day and counts what they have. Pause. The uncomfortable arithmetic is this. The average American spends approximately 11 hours per day engaging with media. Some portion of that media, advertising, aspirational content, influencer economics, streaming services designed to replace boredom with spending, is engaged with during the hours when the firelight ritual should be happening. The slot has been colonized. The window between the end of the day's demands and the onset of sleep, which ancient biology reserved for the precise accounting of resources, now belongs almost entirely to the entities that profit most directly from financial imprecision. This is not a coincidence that anyone engineered in a single moment. It is the cumulative result of 10,000 separate business decisions, each rational in isolation, that together amount to the most efficient displacement of an adaptive human behavior in history. What follows is not an invitation to guilt. It is 3 strategic reframes, offered without sentiment. The first is architectural. The question is not whether to review finances, but when the environmental conditions for doing so are designed into the day. The ancient human's firelight ritual was not a choice made in real time. It was a structural inevitability. The fire went out, the night arrived, and the quiet created the conditions. The modern equivalent requires deliberate environmental design. A specific time, a specific location, insulated from stimulation, where the numbers get seen. Not managed, not optimized. Seen. The brain does its own calibrating once the information is present. The strategic move is creating the conditions for the information to arrive. The second reframe is positional. Most financial anxiety in modern life is not produced by bad circumstances. It is produced by uncertainty about circumstances, by the gap between what one suspects might be true and what one actually knows. The research on this is consistent. Financial stress correlates more strongly with financial uncertainty than with financial insufficiency. People with fewer resources who know their position precisely report less financial anxiety than people with greater resources who don't. The firelight ritual was not a tool for people who had plenty. It was a tool for people who needed to know exactly how little they had, so they could move precisely within those constraints. Precision is not a luxury. It is the mechanism by which constrained actors outmaneuver larger ones. The third reframe is temporal. An institution extends its planning horizon across decades. A corporation knows its position with precision across multiple quarters simultaneously. The individual who knows their position only vaguely is, in every meaningful strategic sense, operating with a shorter planning horizon than the entities they transact with. This asymmetry, precise institutional knowledge against approximate personal knowledge, is the structural condition that makes consumer debt profitable, predatory lending viable, and impulse purchasing endemic. Closing that gap even partially, even imperfectly, is an act with compounding strategic returns. Not because it feels better, because it changes the terms of every subsequent transaction. There is an image that sits at the center of all of this, and it belongs at the end. 30,000 years before the first bank was chartered, before interest rates and credit scores and the entire Baroque infrastructure of modern finance was even thinkable, a human being pressed their back against a rock wall somewhere in what is now southern Europe, felt the chill of coming night, watched the fire reduced to coals, and made a quiet, wordless accounting of what stood between them and death. The spear, the stored food, the number of people who could fight, the distance to water. They ran the calculation not because someone told them to, not because a culture of responsibility had instilled good habits in them, but because the animal that failed to run the calculation was simply gone. That animal's survival instinct lives in you still. It is not a financial philosophy. It is not a wealth-building strategy. It is the oldest cognitive technology your species possesses. The only question is whether the fire goes out before you use it.